There was a village that lived beneath a single, enormous cloud. Not a storm cloud, exactly, though it brought rain sometimes, but a vast, pewter gray shape that had parked itself over the valley long before anyone now living could remember, so permanent in its place that the oldest grandmother in the oldest cottage could not recall a morning when it had not been there. The villagers had long since accepted it the way people accept difficult relatives, with a kind of fond resignation, and a collection of stories told about it in the evening. Some said the cloud was a sleeping dragon whose breath had frozen into vapor centuries ago. Others insisted it was the cloak of a wandering giant who had sat down to rest and simply never risen. Children who grew up under it thought of it as a personal companion, a gray woolen ceiling that kept the world intimate and small, and more than one child had whispered secrets up to it in the early dark before sleep, half convinced it could hear them. Her name was Marin, and she was 12 years old the summer everything changed. She lived with her grandmother in a stone cottage at the edge of the valley where the meadow met the pine forest, and every morning she woke to the same ashen light filtering through her curtains, soft and diffuse, never sharp, never golden, because the cloud ate the sharpness of the sun and left behind something gentler. She had never minded this. The light felt like a lullaby, and she was, at her core, a child who loved lullabies. Her grandmother's name was Ida, and she had silver hair twisted up in a bun and hands roughened by decades of garden work and bread making, and she smelled perpetually of dried lavender and wood smoke. Ida was not a woman who wasted words, but she was also not a woman who wasted silences. She let them sit full and warm between herself and Marin had learned over 12 years that a comfortable silence with someone you loved was one of the finest things in the world. That summer, Marin had taken to climbing. Not mountains, the valley's slopes were gentle, but trees, mostly. The ancient oak at the meadow's edge was her favorite, with a broad arm of a branch about 15 feet up where she could lie flat on her back and look at the cloud and think about whatever needed thinking about. She had been doing a great deal of thinking lately, because her parents had gone abroad for work, something complicated with trade routes and cloth merchants, and though they wrote letters regularly and the letters were loving and full, letters were not the same as a voice at breakfast. She didn't say this to her grandmother. She didn't want Ida to feel insufficient. But she thought it often, up in the oak, looking at the cloud. It was on one such afternoon, a Tuesday in early July when the air smelled of coming rain, that Marin first noticed the light. She had been lying on the branch for perhaps an hour, watching the cloud's underbelly shift in slow, enormous patterns, when a single shaft of sunlight broke through, not at the cloud's edge, as sometimes happened, but right through its center. It lasted only a moment, perhaps 3 breaths, and then the cloud closed over it again. But in those 3 breaths, the meadow below her turned the color of hammered gold. She sat up so fast she nearly fell. She told her grandmother that evening, and Ida set down her knitting and looked at her with an expression Marin couldn't quite read. "I've heard," her grandmother said carefully, "that when the cloud opens like that, it means something is changing." She picked up her knitting again. "Not necessarily something bad. Just something." Marin thought about this through dinner and through the washing up and through the quiet hour her grandmother spent reading by the fire, and she was still thinking about it when she lay in bed listening to the first drops of rain begin to fall on the stone roof, a sound she loved more than almost any other, that steady, patient percussion of water on rock. The next morning the light was different. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have registered to someone who had not spent 12 years studying it, but Marin noticed. It was marginally warmer. The gray had a faint golden undertone, like old ivory, and when she pressed her nose to the window glass and breathed fog onto it, the condensation seemed almost amber. She went to find her grandmother in the garden and reported this, and Ida looked up from her weeding with what Marin now recognized as a carefully neutral expression. Said her grandmother, and went back to her weeding. This was not, Marin understood, dismissal. This was her grandmother's way of saying, I know, but you need to figure out what it means yourself. She spent the morning in the library, a small room off the cottage's main hall that smelled of old paper and the slightly sweet decay of long undisturbed books. Many of them had belonged to her grandfather, who had died before Marin was born but whose presence she felt in the careful handwriting in the margins, small notes, questions, exclamations of delight at some surprising passage. She had read enough of his marginalia over the years that she felt she knew him, in the way you can know someone through their reading. She found what she was looking for in a thin green volume called Notes on the Valley and Its Peculiarities, written in the 1800s by a woman named Theodora Haas. The relevant passage was on page 47, and her grandfather had underlined it in pencil and written in the margin, "True? Ask Mama." The passage read, "The cloud above our valley is not, as many visitors suppose, a purely meteorological phenomenon. It is what my grandmother called a keeper, a concentration of accumulated atmosphere that contains within it the emotional weather of generations. When the valley is in equilibrium, the cloud is stable. When great change approaches, change of the deep and lasting kind, the cloud begins to thin from within, preparing to release what it has held." Marin read this 3 times. Then she sat very still for a while. She was not, she thought, a superstitious person. She believed in causes and effects, in the mechanics of weather, in the way water moved through systems. But she also believed in her grandfather's penciled question marks, and in the particular quality of her grandmother's careful neutrality, and in the way the light had looked that morning, warmer, different, somehow expectant. She went back to the oak that afternoon, and this time she brought a notebook. She began to write down observations, the precise color of the light at different hours, the way the cloud's edges shifted, the moments when the undertone of gold became more or less apparent. She wrote in the careful, exact language her science teacher had encouraged, but she also wrote in the other language she used only in this notebook, the one that described how things felt rather than how they measured. "The light today," she wrote, "is the color of something beginning." That evening, a boy she did not recognize appeared at the gate. He was about her age, perhaps a year older, with sandy hair that stood up unevenly and a travel-worn rucksack that suggested he had come some distance. He stood at the gate with the slightly bewildered look of someone who has walked farther than they planned, and when Marin opened the door he said, with great dignity, "I'm looking for the woman who knows about the cloud." "That's my grandmother," Marin said. She paused. "She doesn't always answer questions directly." "That's all right," he said. "I'm not always sure what questions I'm asking." His name was Kale, and he had walked from the neighboring valley, 2 days east. His family had farmed there for generations, he explained over the tea that Ida produced without comment or ceremony, as if strange children appeared at the gate regularly. His father had recently decided to leave the farm and take work in the city, and Kale had come. He said this with a careful flatness that Marin recognized as the tone you use when feelings are too large to display, to ask whether that was the right thing. Ida listened to all of this with her hands wrapped around her mug and her eyes steady on Kale's face. When he finished, she was silent for a moment, and then she said, "I can't tell you whether your father's decision is right. I don't know enough about your father." But I can tell you that most decisions that feel like the end of something are actually the beginning of something else, and the difficulty is that you can't see the new thing until you're already in motion toward it. Kale thought about this. That's not very comforting, he said finally. No, Ida agreed. But it's true. He stayed the night, sleeping on the narrow cot in the storeroom that Ida kept made up with a readiness that had always made Marin suspect her grandmother expected visitors more than she let on. In the morning, Marin took him to the oak. They lay side by side on the broad branch, it was just wide enough for two, if they were careful, and looked at the cloud together. Marin showed him what she had noticed, the slight warming of the light, the way the cloud's center seemed fractionally thinner than it had been. Kale was quiet for a long time. In our valley, he said finally, we don't have a cloud like this. We have straight sun all day. You'd think that would make things clearer. He paused. It doesn't. Nothing makes things clearer, Marin said, with the authority of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about this. You just get used to what you're looking at. Kale laughed, and it was a surprised, genuine laugh that made the branch vibrate slightly. Marin found, to her own surprise, that she liked him. They spent 3 days together. She showed him the valley, the mill where old Mr. Fenwick ground grain with his enormous flour-dusted hands and a patience that seemed geological, the narrow stream where the water ran cold even in summer and the stones were so round and smooth they looked polished, the southern slope where wild thyme grew in thick carpets and the air smelled like something from another, warmer country. He told her about his valley, the particular quality of its silence in winter, the way the light came off the snow in January so bright it hurt, the cherry tree in his grandmother's garden that bloomed every spring regardless of what the frost had done to everything else. They talked about their parents. Marin admitted, for the first time aloud, that she missed hers, and said it plainly without the apology she usually felt for the admission, and Kale listened without saying anything meaningless, which was, she had already learned, one of his particular skills. He admitted that he was frightened about the move to the city. Not the city itself, he was curious about that, but the idea of his father in a different context, doing different things, becoming subtly different in ways Kale couldn't predict. What if he changes into someone I don't recognize? He asked. People change, Marin said slowly, but they don't usually change in the deep parts. My grandmother says the deep parts are pretty stubborn. Has your grandmother always lived here? As long as anyone can remember. She grew up in this cottage. Kale turned his head to look at her on the branch beside him. Doesn't she ever want to go somewhere else? Marin thought about this. She had never quite asked, not in those words. I think she might have, once, she said. I think she chose to stay. There's a difference, he said, between staying because you're afraid to leave and staying because the place is right for you. Marin looked at the cloud. How do you tell which one it is? I don't know yet, he said honestly. On the 4th morning, when Marin came down to breakfast, her grandmother was standing at the window with a cup of tea and an expression of quiet attention. Come and look, she said, and Marin came. The light in the meadow was extraordinary. Not the flat, gentle gray she had known all her life, and not yet the sharp gold of full sun, something in between, something luminous and diffuse and warm, as if the cloud were lit from within. The sky around its edges was pale blue, a color Marin had seen only at the horizon before, and the cloud itself seemed thinner, more transparent, as if it were slowly becoming gauze. Is it going? Marin asked. Her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Going through something, she said at last. Which is different. Kale found them there a moment later, his hair still disordered from sleep, and stopped in the doorway when he saw the meadow. He stood very still. Then he said, softly, "Oh." "Yes," said Ida. They watched for a long time. The cloud shifted and thinned and gathered and shifted again, its interior luminous, and the light in the meadow moved through variations of gold and amber and soft white that Maren had never seen together and could not quite name. She wrote them in her notebook later, knowing the words were insufficient but writing them anyway, because writing them was a way of honoring what she had seen. Kale left the following afternoon. They walked with him to the edge of the valley, where the path turned east toward his own home, and he stood at the turning point with his rucksack and his uneven hair and his slightly formal manner that Maren now understood was not coldness but a kind of careful respect for other people's privacy. "Will you write?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and there was no question in his voice, which she appreciated. "Are you all right? About going home? About your father?" He considered. "I think I'm going to try to ask my father about his deep parts," he said at last. "Whether he thinks they're changing. I think I've been so worried about the surface I haven't asked about the parts that matter." Maren nodded. "That seems right." He looked back up the valley toward the cloud, which was still extraordinary, still luminous. "I'll tell my valley about yours," he said. "The cloud. The way the light was today." He paused. "If that's all right." "It belongs to everyone," said Ida, who had been standing quietly behind them. "Light always does." Kale looked at her. Then he smiled, a real smile, unguarded. He raised his hand in farewell and turned east, and they watched him go until the path bent around a stand of pine and he disappeared. That night, the cloud opened. It happened near midnight, and Maren was not asleep. She had been lying in the soft familiar dark of her room, thinking about Kale and her parents and the cloud and what Theodora Haas had written about keepers, when the darkness in her room changed character. It lightened. Not to daytime brightness, nothing so dramatic, but the quality of the dark shifted, became less absolute, became silver-edged, and she got up and went to the window. The meadow was full of moonlight. Not the dim, filtered moonlight she had seen on occasional clear-edged nights when the cloud thinned enough to let a glow through. Actual moonlight, hard and brilliant, the shadows of the grass stalks long and precise across the silver ground. She could see the individual leaves of the oak. She could see the line of the stream catching light a quarter-mile away. She could see stars. She had seen stars before, at the valley's edges where the cloud thinned. But not from her bedroom window. Never from here. She stood at the window for a long time, long enough that the chill of the night worked its way through her nightgown and she began to shiver, but she didn't go back to bed. She was watching the cloud. It had not disappeared. It had moved, or perhaps thinned to transparency, or perhaps done something for which she didn't have a word yet. But through it, the sky was visible. A sky full of stars, brilliant and cold and extraordinary. She heard her grandmother's door. Then a soft step in the hallway. Then Ida's hand on her shoulder, warm even through the cotton of her sleeve. They stood together and looked at the sky. "Did this happen when you were a girl?" Maren asked at last. "No," her grandmother said. "I've never seen it like this." "What does it mean?" Ida was quiet for long enough that Maren thought she might do what she sometimes did and simply let the question sit unanswered, which was not dismissal but permission to find the answer herself. But then her grandmother said, "I think it means the cloud has been keeping something for a very long time, and now it's decided we're ready to receive it." What was it keeping? Perspective, Ida said. Distance. The sense of how large things are. Marin looked at the stars. She thought about Kale's Valley, where the sun came sharp and clear and everything was visible but nothing was mysterious. She thought about her own valley, where the cloud had made things intimate and small and close. She thought about what it might mean to live somewhere in between. It's not going away forever, is it? She asked. No, her grandmother said. I don't think so. Just breathing. The word felt right. She held it. In the weeks that followed, the cloud did not disappear but it changed. It was thinner now, more variable. There were days of the old familiar gray diffusion, but there were also mornings when the sun came through in long, slanted shafts, and afternoons when the meadow was half shadow, half gold, a patchwork that Marin found even more beautiful than either alone. She kept her notebook faithfully, documenting the changes, and the notes became more and more her own, less the careful scientific language of observation and more the other language, the one for feelings. A letter came from her parents. They were coming home. Not immediately, there were still several weeks of work remaining, but the date was set, the arrangements made, the letter closing with a warmth that she could feel through the paper, as if the ink itself were warm. She brought the letter to the oak and read it again in the dappled light that now reached the branch in a way it never had before. The branch was the same. The oak was the same. But the light was different, and she found she liked both kinds of different, the familiar and the new, sitting together. She wrote to Kale that evening. She told him about the night the cloud had opened, and the moonlight in the meadow, and what her grandmother had said about perspective. She told him her parents were coming home. She asked whether he had talked to his father yet about the deep parts. His reply came 2 weeks later, quick by the standards of Valley Mail. He had talked to his father, yes. They had sat up until very late, and it had been a difficult conversation and also a good one, the way conversations can be both those things at once. His father had said that the deep parts, he thought, weren't changing, that what he was doing in the city was something his deep parts had always wanted, had always been curious about, and that he had not always known how to say that. Kale said he had not expected to feel better after hearing this, but he had. He also said he had started keeping a notebook. She laughed when she read this, alone in her room, a laugh that surprised her with its warmth, and then she held the letter for a moment and felt, quite precisely, grateful, not for anything specific, but for the general fact of things, for the oak and the light and her grandmother and the notebook and Kale in his valley keeping his own notebook, and for the letter from her parents with its warmth through the paper, and for the cloud itself, which was still there, would still be there, but was no longer exactly what it had been. Her grandmother found her on the cottage steps an hour before sunset, looking at the sky, which was doing something remarkable. The cloud's western edge had gone gold and pink and a deep soft orange, all of it lit from below by the sinking sun, and the whole great gray mass was suffused with color from within, so that what had always been merely gray was revealed to be, underneath, full of rose and amber and the pale lavender of dusk. I thought it was just gray, Marin said. Ida sat down beside her on the steps. Most things, she said, are just gray, right up until the light changes. Marin watched the colors deepen, watched the cloud hold them as it had held so much else, watched the valley below glow with reflected light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She thought about what things looked like before you understood them, and after. She thought about how the cloud had seemed like a limitation, a ceiling, a gray weight, and how it had turned out to be a keeper, patient and enormous, full of what it had been quietly gathering. She put her head on her grandmother's shoulder, and her grandmother's arm came around her, and they sat that way until the sun had gone below the ridge and the colors faded and the cloud was gray again, differently gray now, knowingly gray, the gray of something that had just shown you what it was capable of. "I'm glad the cloud is still here," Marin said. "So am I," said her grandmother, in the voice she used when she meant more than the words. The stars came that night. Not all of them, the cloud was still there, would be there tomorrow and the next day, but enough. Enough to navigate by, enough to make wishes on if you were inclined, enough to remind you that the universe was very large and you were in it, which is a fact that manages to be both humbling and comforting depending on your state of mind. Marin lay in her bed and listened to the night. The oak made its slow sounds in the breeze. The stream murmured at its distance. An owl called, twice, and was answered somewhere further up the slope. She thought about silver linings, and how everyone says it, that every cloud has one, and how it is so often said as consolation, as if the cloud is the bad thing and the lining is the compensation, the silver edge you find when the worst is over. But she thought it might be more complicated than that. She thought maybe the cloud was not the bad thing at all. The cloud was the keeper, the accumulator, the thing that held the valley close and intimate, that softened the harshest light and made even ordinary mornings feel like something wrapped and precious. And the silver lining was not just the edge of it, not just the compensation for the gray, it was the whole interior, visible only when the light was right, only when something had changed enough that you could see what had always been there. The silver was not what you found when the cloud lifted. The silver was what the cloud had been holding all along. She closed her eyes. The room was soft and dark and the sounds of the valley were steady and known around her. She thought she might write to Kale again tomorrow. She thought she might climb the oak in the morning and see what the light looked like now, whether it had changed again overnight, whether there was some new quality she hadn't seen before. She thought about her parents coming home and the dinner they would have and her father's particular laugh and her mother's habit of humming while she cooked. She thought about her grandmother downstairs, reading or perhaps not reading, perhaps just sitting in the lamplight in her particular stillness. She thought about the cloud outside the window, going slowly about its business, enormous and patient, full of light it had not yet shown, full of weather it had not yet made, full of whatever it had gathered from this valley over all the long years, the breath of sleeping children and the smoke of winter fires and the sound of the stream in its different seasons, the whole accumulated atmosphere of a place that had been loved by the people in it. She thought these things and then she stopped thinking them, the way you do when sleep comes quietly, the way the cloud had parted, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, gently, in its own time. The room breathed around her. Outside, the stars kept their old positions, the cloud moved in its slow, enormous way, and the valley lay quiet in the night, held between the mountains, covered and open all at once, the same as it had always been and somehow, in some deep way that would take a long time to understand, entirely new.